Prosecutors played wiretaps in court that showed Gotti repeating Connor's addresses on the phone, and then hinting at his sentence. FBI agents were waiting in a car across the street. They had enough tape evidence to bring Gotti and his company back to trial. 3 mafiosi were arrested immediately after dinner. Gotti faced a number of racketeering charges, including ordering 4 murders. One of these attempts was made on Polo Costolano. Gotti and Gravano were denied bail. In terms of business, it was a prosperous time for Gotti and the Gambino family. The racket brought the family $500 million a year. Much of the success was due to Consigliere Gotti and later underboss with Emmy Beck-Grovan, a strong guy who was involved in the construction business. It's a little surprising that John Gotti chose Sammy Gravano. Sammy was the one who was truly powerful. He was young enough to pose a threat to John Gotti. But I don't think John Gotti ever thought Sammy Gravano would betray him. Gotti said about Grovan that he was like a brother to him. He can trust him with his life. He always talked about hating rats, and Sammy always hated snitches, and despised people who became rats. On the FBI tapes, Gotti told Grovan how much he cared about the public. Gotti has made himself the most visible mafia boss since Scarface and Al Capone, sporting a snazzy $2,000 suit and frequenting New York's most famous nightclubs. The old era of the mafia is gone. When John Gotti walked into a restaurant, it was always an event. 10 people came in with him, wearing an expensive coat, generally impeccably dressed. Everyone started running around him. He began to believe that he was omnipotent. In one conversation with Sammy Grovan, they were sitting at a table in a restaurant and John turned to Sammy and said, "Hey, look at these people, they're smiling at me, they love me." And Gravano looks around, 2 young guys were sitting there. One stands up and says to John, "Mr. Gotti, I've always wanted to meet you. You are very gorgeous," and came back and sat at the table. And John said, "Sammy, I told you all, they love us." In January 1989, Gotti was again indicted. Union agent Jonah Connor, 4 years ago, sent a group of thugs to destroy a restaurant of non-union workers. It turned out that this restaurant belonged to the Gambino family. And Connor was shot 4 times in the buttocks. John Gotti took revenge on John Connor by shooting him. Prosecutors played court wiretap recordings of guests repeating Connor's addresses over the phone, and then hinting at his sentence. Because of these words he was arrested. The jury had doubts about his guilt. The judge asked the jury, "Do you think John Gotti is guilty or not guilty in this case?" And he was found not guilty. John Gotti was free again and set off fireworks in Little Italy. To celebrate this event, the feds were still listening and waiting for the right moment to take him. In the 90s, John Gotti cemented his reputation as the Teflon Don. But he did not count on the betrayal of his closest friend Sammy Grovan. December 11, 1990, guests Sammy and underboss Frankie Lucas met for dinner at the Revenant Social Club. The agent and the FBI were waiting in a car across the street. They had enough taped evidence to bring Gotti and company back to trial. 3 mafiosi were arrested immediately after dinner. Gotti faced a number of racketeering charges, including ordering 4 murders. One of these attempts was made on Polo Costolano. Gotti and Gravano were denied bail. While Sam and John were imprisoned together, they both thought about how to get out of prison. Sammy Gravano suggested escaping by tying up the sheets. And John Gotti thought he was crazy. Gotti's proposal was even crazier than Sammy Grovan's. He wanted to bribe the president. He said we could raise $5 million and we could go directly to the president and bribe him. Sammy looked at John, John looked at Sam, and I realized that each thought that the other was crazy. This time, Gotti couldn't count on his longtime lawyer, Bruce Cutler. The government said Cutler was too close to organized crime. On one of the tapes he was heard complaining about Cutler's fees. While in prison, Sammy knew that he could be involved in 19 murders. And then Sammy decided to become what he always hated, To become a rat, he agreed to testify against the boss of the family in exchange for a more lenient sentence. Gotti was devastated at the trial. His significant other, Sammy the Bull, stood up to him and told the world how John was running the Gambino family, and how Gotti and he planned the murder of Costello. Gravano took a moment to look at Gotti. But when he saw Gotti looking at him, he had an expression on his face that is hard to describe. If just a look could kill, they would have killed each other that day in the hall. It took the jury less than 2 days to find Gotti guilty on all charges. I was with John when he was sentenced. He received life in prison without parole. The judge also ordered a court fee of $50, and after the trial we were back in the pre-trial detention cell. John takes the tie off his shirt and says that everything is clear with the verdict, but still paying $50 is too much, and laughs. Gotti was sent to the maximum security federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. After his sentence, Gravano was in the witness protection program under a new name. And the Gambino family will never be the same. John Gotti made a lot of money for himself and his immediate family. But in the end, he destroyed the criminal activities of the Gambino family. In prison, Gotti told the family that he wanted his son, John Jr., to take over the family. John Gotti ended up making the same bad decisions that he so hated from his predecessors. That's why he didn't like Paul Castellani, because he didn't earn his position, he got it because of his family ties to Carlo Gambino. But ultimately what John Gotti did was he put his son in charge, who is not a very experienced gangster. He was too young to be the boss of the family. There were many other people, hundreds of such people, who were more worthy with more experience in that life. So he ended up being the one he hated his entire life in the Mafia. But the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. John Gotti Jr. had many connections at his disposal because of his father's name. And the family had access to new developments. He greatly developed high-tech communication systems, computers, and new technologies. A lot of Mafia guys were involved in this. Big money was being made. John went with a gang of thugs who introduced him to weightlifting. He also spent his time spending his days in bars and discos in the Bronx and other boroughs of New York. While many families did not take John Jr. seriously, they did not challenge him. No one wanted to become the new boss of the Gambino family, the risk far outweighed the glory. If I were a mafioso, I wouldn't want this. Because once you accept this position, you will be persecuted. I'd rather stay in the shadows. My money would allow my girlfriends to have fun. Why do I need all this attention? The remaining members of the family, approximately 200 people, under the leadership of John Jr., were still involved in racketeering and were involved in construction and trucking. There were people who advised John in business. Among these elders was Carlo Gambino's son Tommy. Tommy Gambino rose to capo in the family, but nothing more. He was very similar to his father. From his long nose to his gentlemanly manners. But all his life, Tommy felt trapped by the inheritance he inherited from his father. His house was wiretapped by the FBI. Tommy once said that I never had the chance. Say okay, I'll do what I want. I always did everything for my family, for my children, for my father. This is a very moving statement for Tommy Gambino. He always believed in what he was told. For decades, Tommy controlled the clothing industry. But in 1992, Gambino's grip was broken. Tommy, along with his brother and business partner Joseph, pleaded guilty to antitrust charges. And they were forced to abandon much of their freight traffic. In the mid-1990s, Tommy was sentenced to 5 years in prison for issuing loans and gambling. Therefore, the Gambino family was in many ways deprived of the legendary leadership they had enjoyed for many years. Returning to what was said, Vincent Mangano, Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano were legendary. Paul Castellano tried to do a lot of good for the family and directed the business into legal schemes. And John Gotti just destroyed this family. The family has been destroyed, so the growth of this criminal organization reaches its peak. And everything collapses. I think a final thought might be a quote from Paul Castellano. This is our life, this is a wonderful life. If you can live that kind of life and stay out of trouble, that's great. But it's very unpredictable. And there are so many chances to screw up. And in the end they screwed up.